Human resources employees, what are your best HR nightmare stories? Not an HR employee, but a manager who was handed an HR nightmare to help resolve. Someone will get a kick out of this. Some background: I was working as a teller manager in a small regional bank. My branch had 6 small colleges within a 30-minute drive. The company liked to hire college students to work as tellers because they usually didn't want to work full time, no benefits, therefore cheaper to employ. And with their somewhat random availability, it was easy to schedule even the unpopular shifts. All of the tellers in my branch are college students. I got a call from the regional HR manager. He's transferring a teller to my location from another branch across town who has been nothing but a headache. I am to document every single thing that this teller does wrong, no matter how minor the infraction. Apparently, she had ticked off all of her coworkers there by filing HR complaints against all of them. I'll call her TT, transfer teller, from here on. I was able to get more detail out of one of her managers. TT was a student at one of the local colleges, but her only hobbies were riding in her horse and going to church. The only thing she ever wanted to talk about was her horse, her beliefs, and trying to convert coworkers to her religion. Talk about anything else, and she'd find a way to connect the topic to violating her beliefs. Criticize her or talk about something that she wouldn't do, and she'd file a complaint. TT was transferred to my branch, and on her first day, she went off on another teller for talking about a date that the teller's boyfriend had taken her on. The next day, she filed her first HR complaint against one of my staff for talking about using a certain famous dating app. Speaking to TT while taking the complaint, discovered she's very socially conservative. The employee handbook said, in summary on the topic, what counts depended on what offended the most easily offended person present, so watch your mouth and where you talked. I pulled each teller into a one-on-one meeting, walked them through the sections of the handbook, and warned them to be careful of what they discussed. I didn't call out TT, but everyone guessed who we were talking about. Word about her had made its way around the grapevine. Over the course of the next couple of weeks, she filed a new complaint roughly every other day. All of the complaints were for coworkers talking about or doing normal things, such as a coworker went to a party, saw a coworker hug her boyfriend when he brought her lunch, a coworker wore a blouse that showed a bit, a coworker refused to get up early on Sunday to come to church with her. Morale was low, everyone is stressed coming in every day, most of the staff are refusing to talk to TT. I'm grumbling to the HR manager who just answers everything with document her infractions. So I'm writing up every minor mistake, categorizing them, and for each category, I think I have enough, composing a formal write-up and submitting it to HR for approval. I wish I could remember how many I wrote. I was sure we'd be stuck with TT for months before I had enough tardies or drawer errors for HR to be willing to fire her. But after about a month, she had made the error we needed. There's a religious group that's well known in our state, and the group's HQ is in our city. The group's religious leader occasionally would come into my branch. For some reason, he liked dropping off deposits and transfers himself. It didn't take much to get him preaching on a topic. Everyone would just smile and nod along while finishing his transaction. But TT couldn't do that. Apparently, her church has some issues with what his church teaches. He came in to run a transaction. She called him next out of line. While running his transaction, she recognized the name of the church. They started talking, then arguing, then she was yelling at him. Unfortunately, I was in the back, so I missed this. Fortunately, I was in the bank, so it went on long enough that her customer took offense. She was dragged into the back to separate them. He filed a complaint, which I wrote up as an official customer complaint. Those get reviewed by a VP and the operations director, but I also CC'd HR manager. Religious mistreatment of a commercial customer with a few million on deposit was sufficient for HR to terminate her the next day. Yeah, so she really knew how to stir the pot though, didn't she? Story 2. I am on the HR team that supports a wide variety of U.S. cities for our company, including our colorful Florida locations. This is the best story I heard. We had some woman trying to avoid doing work by sitting out in her car in the parking lot. While she was hiding out there, she needed to use the restroom. Well, instead of going back inside or doing literally anything else, she decides to whiz out her car window. Even though I am also a woman, I was impressed and disgusted by the physics behind this feat. She had stuck her back outside the window and just went for it. Unbeknownst to her, her male coworker had arrived at work late due to an appointment. He drove past to find a parking spot as this was happening and got a full view. He then reported the incident to us. One of our HR people had to investigate this, and sure enough, parking lot cameras could corroborate his story. Our HR person confronted the woman. Her response, well, how did he know it was me? It could have been anyone. We thought, okay, fair enough. The cameras aren't CSI grade zoom, so we only saw the back part. It was harder to completely identify the face. So we went back to the male peer and asked how he knew it was her. His response? Oh, it was definitely her. The face tattoos are pretty recognizable. We definitely don't get paid enough for this. Story 3. I don't work in HR, but I do have a nightmare HR story. When I was on my gap year, I worked a part-time job as a fitness instructor at a leisure center. One of my coworkers, let's call him Bill, was a nice guy, and I would often sit and chat to him on my breaks, etc., long-term GF and baby at home. As part of my job, I used to teach spinning classes on a fairly regular basis. I would normally leave my phone in the staff room while I was teaching or behind the reception desk. Both these places were secure and my phone had a passcode on it. I didn't want it going off while I was teaching because when it received calls or text, it interfered with the stereo in the spin studio. I didn't have a locker or anything where I could store it. Sometime around January, I was at uni for an interview weekend. My girlfriend at the time had come to pick me up, and while she was waiting in the car, she was scrolling through my messages on my iPad. When I got in the car, she showed me one of my chats and said, "Why did you send this video to Bill?" I had no recollection of sending any videos to Bill since I did not speak to him outside of work beyond "I'm going to be late" or similar. I thought it was a mistake, but as I scrolled further back, I saw that I had sent this same video to Bill a couple weeks prior. Feeling thoroughly perplexed, I clicked into the video and saw it was a video of me and my girlfriend on holiday in Thailand. I'd like to stress that it was not that kind of video. We were just joking around, but we had just gotten out of the shower. At this point, I'm still thinking it's some kind of big mistake, as Bill is a nice guy with a baby at home. However, I look a little closer and realize that the dates and times of when I had sent these videos was at times I was teaching spin classes and therefore had left my phone unattended. Bill, being the sicko he was, had obviously seen me put my passcode into my phone during all the times we had been sitting, chatting on breaks, etc., and had memorized it. He had then taken the opportunity to scroll through all my personal photos and videos when I had left my phone unattended to go and teach classes. I'm assuming that he had deleted the video once, hence why he had sent it to himself again a couple of weeks later. He'd also deleted the chat history from my iPhone but hadn't realized it synced to my iPad. This was in around 2012, by the way. Obviously, I reported this to my manager and to HR, but it was a bit of a minefield for them to navigate. I don't know what he told them, but I imagine it was along the lines of saying I sent them to him of my own free will. How would he have known my password, etc.? It took a long while to get sorted out, but in the end, he did get sacked, thankfully. The police also paid him a visit, so I'm sure he had some explaining to do to his SO. Story 4. I was asked to translate for some visitors from the parent company at a celebration held by HR. I stopped translating around the time the director of HR started asking overly personal questions to the two young HR office ladies. A couple days later, during a private session, I recounted the story to a friend who happened to be a director from the parent company. He put on his professional hat and asked me to write it up and submit a complaint to the parent company's HR. Nightmare ensued. Local head of HR had been in charge of the mistreatment avoidance training that had narrowly saved them from lawsuit. The CEO of the local company insisted that I bring the story out in public and talk to the director of HR like an adult. Parent company HR brought in HR from another local subsidiary to perform an investigation. It became painfully obvious who the whistleblower was. Nothing came of the investigation that I heard about, but the next year was made to be a living hell for me by the local company. Even the office lady who had been the subject of the sexy inquisition resented the fact that she was in the center of a controversy. I left that company as soon as I possibly could and was not saddened to hear of their bankruptcy and partition a couple of years later. They had other issues as well. Story 5. The last company I worked for did not have an HR department. My boss was one of the worst people I have ever met. And if they did have HR, she would have been gone a long time ago. The one incident that made me hightail it out of there was she used a doctor's note of mine to get out of a class she was taking. A month or so before, I had a missed termination at 18 weeks and had to have a D&C. My doctor wrote me a note for work so I could have 2 weeks for recovery and time to process what had just happened. I found multiple doctored copies of my doctor's note on the printer. The dates were changed and a part in the note excusing me from work was changed to class. I remember seeing it and my heart dropped and I immediately had anxiety. I also thought at first someone else was going through the same thing until I looked at it closer and realized it was mine. I felt extremely used and exposed. A coworker of mine actually walked in on her trying to fix it up on the computer. I ended up telling the CEO because that was her boss. I left my coworker out of the story because she was a single mom and my boss was lenient with her hours, so I didn't want her to make it harder on her. He encouraged me to talk to her about it, which I did, and they played it off like she didn't do it. I was told it was in the executive drive, so only the executives could get to it. My boss was the only female executive, and it was a doctor's note from an OB-GYN, and she was the only one taking a class. They basically offered me a raise and title change after that. I took it, knowing I was trying for a baby and wanted the money to save up. Going back, I wish I held my ground and quit. Story 6. Where do I start? One employee wouldn't work once it got dark because he was scared of ghosts. In the interview, he asked if the building was haunted. He was from Asia and refused to listen to a woman boss. I asked him to do something. He would say okay, and then literally stuff the task between files and storage so I couldn't find it. If my husband asked him to do something, he couldn't jump high enough to get it done. He accused every single female employee of mistreating him, and his wife didn't appreciate it. I asked for examples. The 55-year-old woman who is as sweet as a grandma asked him what cologne he was wearing. It smelled like he wore the whole bottle. I was looking for employees when a friend suggested I hire him, and I said we already had and it wasn't working well due to his wife's complaints. Her response, "Wife? He's not straight. Haven't you met his husband?" Apparently, to our work events, he was bringing his sister as his wife. After he worked for us, he applied for a job elsewhere and listed my husband as a reference. A woman called to do a check, and my husband told her he didn't work with him. That I did, but she wouldn't talk to me because my name wasn't listed. She asked him a few questions about his duties, and my husband explained his duties. Long pause on the other end. "That's not what he has listed," he said, to which my husband said those were my duties as a manager/business owner, and he never ever had access to such positions, and then he went on to explain to her this guy would never take direction for me. She quickly ended the convo. Before we invested in cameras, we had one season where money theft was constantly happening and we had an idea who it was but couldn't catch her. She manipulated us. It was my first year and I was naive. She always had a new, fake type of cancer for reasons for missing work. One day, a client came storming into my office and said she and several others would take their business away if we didn't terminate her. Now, not being from this area, I didn't have any background except her reference check. Turns out she's stolen money and credit card numbers from various places of employment, but she's never been charged because she's always apologized or repaid it back. So then the money missing made sense and we were right. Once we got rid of her, the money stopped disappearing. She reapplied later on and her resume was so padded I turned it into a drinking game. The duties she put down under her position at my businesses either 1, didn't exist, or 2, were my job. When you pad your resume, don't send it to a previous employer. One employee developed a drinking problem. I couldn't figure out why they were going outside every 15 minutes for a cigarette. I dismissed it at first because they were hard workers, put in long hours, and barely took a lunch break. But then I was finding bottles hidden in places, and on the day I caught it, they had also coded on antidepressant meds and helped hold them down as they kept trying to strip and run. They were admitted to the psych ward. I didn't hear anything for days, and one day they just showed back up. The hospital let them out on day passes to come back to work because they would be in the hands of a responsible adult. This wasn't cleared or discussed with me at all. One girl started off great, on time, professional, great office etiquette. I thought I'd hit the jackpot. One day she went out for her smoke break and forgot to come back. I asked her the next day what happened and she looked at me dazed and confused and said she did come back. I showed her the time clock and camera and she said she had no idea what happened. She started missing shifts and on one busy Friday didn't show up and I couldn't get a hold of her. Another employee had gone out for lunch and said she was outside our office hammered, laying in the street. I went out there to talk to her and she was adamant she didn't work that day. Her glasses were broken and she was scraped up with 2 very large men who were intimidating. She ran away from me, missed her Saturday shift, emailed me Sunday saying she had been in the hospital with a liver infection and would be in Monday with a note. I asked her for the note both Monday and Tuesday, and she ran home to get it and never came back. She didn't remember seeing me when she was hammered, and she was still wearing her broken glasses. Honestly, I could go on and on. One girl I have chance after chance, but after missing 17 shifts and then showing up hammered to talk about it, I was done. But don't worry, she claimed she wasn't drinking, she was just around people who were drinking, so that's why she smelled. Story 7. One place I used to work, one of the upper management guys who was in charge of the warehouse would hop on the forklifts and do donuts. He had colon cancer and was always having surgeries to remove another section of colon, so he had a colostomy bag. He would squeeze air out of his bag while he was doing donuts on the forklifts. It would waft this god awful stench everywhere. Everyone thought it was hilarious and would immediately run outside for a smoke break until the scent dissipated. The smell was bad enough it made a coworker retch. I also had another manager there eat 10 sacks of White Castle sliders for lunch. He ate the last 10 sacks on the toilet. I have no idea how he could eat with the sounds and stenches he was emitting from his other end. It sounded like someone trying to drown Donald Duck in a puddle while tooting a tuba. No one went into that bathroom for the rest of the day. Story 8. My boss told me about this one. I don't work in HR, but this involved HR at my job. We had one hourly employee that wasn't performing well and was engaging with his new boss, one of the assistant directors in our department. He was pretty arrogant and would pawn his work off on the student employees and would just sit around watching YouTube or ESPN on his phone. He'd been given all of the formal warnings and such, so he should have expected being fired. My boss, his boss's boss, and his boss had planned on terminating him near the end of the day. HR sends out letters for termination that are normally presented by the boss in person. For some reason, the process had been run differently and the letter had been taken to the mailroom by HR. Our department is pretty close to the mailroom, so we see when mail is delivered. His letter was put in his mailbox around noon, and one of the student workers gave him his mail. He read it and flipped out. He started walking through the hallway saying, "Well, I guess I'm fired, screw this place." He did this for a solid half hour before my boss found out. She was at lunch. When my boss got wind of the situation, she went to try and calm him down and de-escalate the situation. He then threw some of his personal items across the room, told my boss he was coming after her job next, screamed out all of his coworkers and employees, screamed out HR, screamed out the president on his way out. The bad thing is, HR was going to offer him the chance to resign rather than being terminated because there are very few jobs in our industry in the area and jobs are hard enough to come by without a termination, plus his wife didn't work, so they were going to let him stay on our insurance for longer than COBRA mandates. My boss still offered that option to him as he threw a keyboard at her. Needless to say, he didn't take the offer. I worked from home during this time frame, so I had no idea any of it happened until a year later. Story 9. My mom doesn't read it, so I'll type this out for her. We received an outside email with a photo attachment. The photograph was of a nurse we employed with what looked like a glass pipe of some sort in her lap. The email alleged that she was a user. We found out later it came from an ex-girlfriend she had just broken up with. It prompted us to go seek out the nurse. When we arrived at her desk, she was on the phone with a patient but visibly nodding off. We requested she come to the HR office with us to talk, then we confronted her with the allegation. She denied everything and agreed to a test. Instead of sending her to an outside lab, we had one send technicians to our office building to administer the test, and that's when things went south. She began telling us she needed to go out to her car. We believe this was because she planned to use synthetic samples or someone else's, and us not sending her to an outside lab lost her the opportunity to do that, and we flatly told her that leaving the bathroom would be noted as a refusal to take the test, which would mean an automatic termination. This woman proceeded to throw a tantrum on the floor of the bathroom for the next 7 hours of the day. We had to shut down that entire bathroom. Other employees started a rumor we were holding a pregnant woman hostage, and at lunchtime she demanded a meal. So I went to the cafeteria, purchased her a sandwich and drink, and then she ate it on the bathroom floor. After hours of tears and yelling, 5 p.m. rolled around and she calmly stood up and said, "It's the end of my shift, so I'll be leaving now." We repeated to her that leaving would still be considered a refusal and grounds for immediate termination. At this time, the technician, who had also been there watching all of this for the last 7 hours, tried to intervene and talk some sense into her. Eventually, she reluctantly agreed to a buccal swab rather than a test, and then she left for the day. Needless to say, the results we got back were positive, and she was terminated as well as reported to the licensing boards. I thought that was the end of it until several weeks later when she called to complain her insurance card was no longer valid and she couldn't pick up a prescription. This turned into an hour-long discussion about how losing employment also means losing the benefits. And if you're enjoying the video so far, please don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 10. I work for the civil service in the HR department, and I've heard some crazy things. A lot comes to mind, but I suppose the first thing that I thought was the time that we were clearing out room old paperwork, and I was relatively new. Some of the older colleagues were commenting on some of the files we were finding as they remember the cases. Things like, oh, I remember this woman. She got married to this guy in the post office. Or, this guy went through stage 4 cancer. Good for him. One of the files they picked up, they just said casually, remember this job? He's the one that hurt his manager and ended up with a promotion. Crazy. And just moved right on past. I was like, whoa, hold up. I need the end to that story, please. Turns out they were out for a Christmas dinner, and this guy had a fight with his manager, grabbed a steak knife, and hurt him. Because of some strange circumstances at the time in government and who he was connected to, they couldn't or wouldn't fire him, so decided to transfer him to a different department. Only that there were no more positions left at his grade, and he wouldn't settle for a lower grade, so they ended up promoting him to a higher position, including all benefits and pay. Silver service, eh? Story 11. Not from HR, but I work for a big corporation, and I saw a racial event unfold between Subject A, an African American and the offended, and Subject B, a Middle Eastern Arab, the offender, where B started calling A the N-word in front of a bunch of other people who started telling him to stop. But B kept going telling others to shut up and that he was entitled to say the N-word and offend A with it because he wasn't white and A shouldn't feel offended about it. Subject A really controlled himself and left the building. B chased him around the building, still provoking him, and after A left, came back and tried to explain to the others why he did it. Everyone involved sent a letter to HR explaining the events. A had a talk with his manager and HR. B was sent home for a week while HR did the investigation. When B came back, he was called to a meeting room, got a strong reprimand from HR, and that's it. He kept working for a year, got into other issues with people. Nobody wanted to work with him until he started intimidating women, physically and verbally. That's when his manager and HR finally decided to get rid of him, but still took them almost a month. I guess some people just don't learn that lesson. Story 12. I work in HR, and we recently moved from one HRIS system to another system that manages personal information like benefits, time of request, contact information, etc. Part of the transition is teaching the workforce how to use the app. There are a lot of challenges, including the boomers who are technology illiterate, employees who speak very little English, and managers who think learning the system is below their pay grade. I'm normally pretty patient with the language barrier. I mean, it's not like I am bilingual either, so if they have the basics of English as a second language, they already know more than I do. One fine day, I had a constrained stream of employees trying to figure out how to access the system in their phones despite these step-by-step written and pictorial instructions when I had this one older individual ask me to help him. Nothing but videos would come up on his smartphone browser. He legit couldn't understand why I couldn't help him. The browser just kept going back no matter what I typed in. I usually feel like I can figure people's phones out, but I reached my limit. I couldn't tell if the poor guy had a virus on his phone or if he was messing with me. Creepy old guy, my father's age, barely speaks English, and not embarrassed by the raunchy video stuck on his screen. I told him to go get his phone cleaned up and don't come back with it until he's fixed it. I haven't seen him since. Story 13. Not HR myself, but a coworker of mine is undoubtedly one. I'll call him Jay, and I'll preface this by saying, yes, these are true stories with some details omitted to protect both our identities, and that I don't know how he's managed to stay employed for 15 plus years. My closest guess is because he outlasts all the managers he gets his final warning from. He's outlasted at least 5 managers. Also, this is in America, and the age of consent here is 16. My first month into my job, Jay comes into the crowded staff room with his phone and earphones plugged in. The door leading to the outside area was locked, so he sat in the middle of the staff room and talked to the woman on his phone. I finish up my break and head back to work, whereupon, a few minutes later, the HR head leads my manager, Jay, Jay's sister, our coworker, and our assistant manager to her office. I wasn't told anything by them. However, I just spent my break talking to a woman from another department who was also on break long enough to see what happened. Jay had started dirty talking to a woman on his phone in the middle of the staff room and was egging her on to show him more while in the still crowded staff room. One of the other employees looked over his shoulder to confirm what he was doing, then reported him to HR. He was monitored on break for a week or so, then back to normal. After a year of me working there, we got help from a student who would work on weekends. Jay has a history of shady business with women. He wanted to run away with a Welsh girl he met on a dating app, and he pestered a high school Burger King server every day until she quit. He was assigned to work late at night with her one night, just the two of them. A few days later, we're informed that an incident has caused Jay to be suspended for 2 weeks. Eventually, he came back and accidentally let some details slip that led us to piece together that he'd acted inappropriately to the point she reported and then filed a restraining order against him. He was suspended but came back early because she quit. Likely, she wasn't happy that they didn't do much until she literally got a restraining order against him. That time, he seemed to have finally learned his lesson. We had a new girl start working there, and she said that he never speaks to her when they're working together. Even when she'd ask a question, he'd just stare, awkwardly laugh, and wander off. They still assigned him to work with her despite his past offenses because of staff shortages and, in my opinion, mismanagement. Story 14. The nightmare of an HR employee potentially causing the HR nightmare. I took a grad course meant to prepare future school principals on HR stuff. One of our assignments was to ask our current principal for redacted copies of disciplinary letters they'd written to use as examples to practice writing our own. This assignment seemed sketchy from the get-go, but whatever, it's grad school and I want an A. The course was taught by the HR director who had helped hire me and my building principal in the same school year. The principal didn't have any letters from before I started there, so just gave me a couple of random ones. Somehow, the professor was still surprised when I came to class knowing all the details of each write-up despite the absence of detail in the letters. The professor flipped out a little because he was worried the principal had broken some confidentiality rule. It was actually just that I happened to be friends with the two that had been written up. Teacher HR is a nightmare unto itself. Well, I guess that's one way to get a real-world education. Story 15. Government employer. Agency management fired a popular program manager with about 250 employees under him who all love him. He's entitled to a public hearing about his dismissal if he desires, which he demands, after his HR meeting and his private hearing before the agency brass. Everybody packs into the auditorium, all 250 of his employees there to advocate for him. His lawyer gives an opening statement about how he's been fired for caring too much and for refusing to cut corners the agency brass wanted to cut and for protecting his people from politicians trying to score political points and blah, blah, blah. Cheers from the crowd. Our HR director stands up. She's booed. She informs the hearing that the guy forged every single one of his employees' as required by law assessment forms that determined raises and promotions. He forged the signatures of all 250 people there and filled the forms randomly. She puts examples of the forgery up on screen. It's obvious. He ran out of time and didn't want to get reprimanded for disorganization, a long-running but minor problem with him. So he forged a ton of government documents. 250 people walked right out of the hearing, furious. He hadn't told any of them the real reason he got fired. He told them it was random retaliation for being awesome. He knew the agency had all this evidence, had been presented to him twice before, and he had admitted he'd done it. It was insane. I guess he figured he had nothing to lose by punting. He became such a pariah, he had to move. Story 16. I haven't been able to tell this story for so long. I managed a smaller company and also served as the HR guy. I had this one employee who needed rides to work for a short while, so I'd pick him up when he needed one. One day, I go to pick him up, and we are driving away. He very calmly tries to explain that one of the employees of the company we were servicing had approached him, saying that another one of our employees basically cornered her in the break room and kept trying to get close to her, flexing by saying that he had family that were higher-ups in the company she's worked for. I kept trying to ask where she lived for some reason. There was more to it that I can't quite remember, but basically, he was hitting on her. Once he had said, trapped her in the break room, I U-turned and sped back to the site, running frantically inside and finding the girl who I actually knew from high school somewhat vaguely. I pull her aside and ask about what happened. She repeated basically the same thing to me. Thing is, this guy is married, but the way she quoted him, it definitely sounded like she was telling the truth. And we had zero problems up to this point. I had no reason to believe she would just do this out of nowhere. I apologized profusely and told her she would never have to see him here again. She was very kind and understanding. With the other employee still in my car, I sped to the other guy's house, let's call him Dan, and knocked on his door. He answers, and immediately I demand the keys for the on-site vehicle. Once he hands them over, I unleash hell. So, I heard this interesting story that you wouldn't leave this girl alone and you kept trying to ask where she lived and wouldn't let her leave the break room. He immediately glances back over his shoulder because his wife is nearby in the kitchen and comes outside and closes the door. He talks and whispers, I didn't talk to anyone. Me, they have cameras, so how about I go ask security to take a look? Dan starts trying to guide me over to the parking lot away from his front door as his wife gets it open to listen in on what's going on. I was in the break room with some chick, but I didn't do anything except say hello and ask if I would be in her way for cleaning. I was mad. I could tell by the way he was acting. He was desperate for me not to say anything. Me? I find it odd we've had that location for over a year, and a week after I put you there, I get the first complaint I have ever had to deal with. He tries getting all puffy chested, saying stuff like, "How dare you question my integrity and won't even let me hear my side of the story?" So, were you blocking the doorway so she couldn't leave or not? No. I shrug. Okay, fine. I'm going to go back and see what the cameras have. And if I see otherwise, then you're fired. Then I start walking away and he shouts out, "Then I'm done, Alice Snap." Great. Pick up your last check tomorrow so I don't have to deal with you ever again. This guy was a pain. Twice my age. This was his second job. Always tried to make himself seem vital while he would also complain about any job I put him on. It all just kind of came out right then and there. So I leave and ignore the argument between him and his wife that breaks out, and I get into my car and drive off. Other employee riding with me breaks the silence with, "So we're good, right?" LOL. Anyways, went back and saw footage of him definitely obstructing the doorway when she was obviously trying to get out. Several minutes of conversation, no sound, just passage of time. Freaking creep. Passed by him at the store the other day, but this happened a couple years ago. Story 17. Not HR, but I had a coworker at a bakery who quit in a most spectacular fashion. She was quirky, to say the least. The first time I met her, I was shoulder deep in a big bowl of buttercream when I felt a hard slap on my back. I turned around, totally shocked, my arm covered in frosting, to see a total stranger. She grinned and said, "Hey, girlfriend, which one's your favorite Prince song?" I said I wasn't sure, and she responded, "Me neither, but if I had to pick, I'd take broccoli over asparagus any day." One day, she was working up front, making coffees and helping customers and what have you. She was in the midst of filling the honey container that went out for customers to use for the coffees. This was a messy, sticky job as the honey came in a 50-pound tub, and it needed to go into one of those tiny bears. Our manager asked her to come to the back for a second. I was back by the ovens, pulling out a rack of cookies, and I overheard the manager informing her that she was being written up for tardiness, which was fair. She was 15 to 30 minutes late every day. He asked her to sign a document saying that she had been informed of the write-up so it could go in her file. Girlfriend lost her mind. She started shouting and insulting everything from his choice of shoes to his wife's hair to the way he walked. She then threw her hat at him while shouting, "I quit your dumb job." She walked across the bakery, through a line of customers, across a parking lot, and out to the bus stop to wait for the bus while shouting and smeared with sticky honey. Our coworkers were giving the managers some very dirty looks. The thing that has always baffled me about this whole exchange is that the hat and shirt were issued by the bakery and had the logo on them. Story 18. I got a good one. Last place I worked was a crappy internet company. I was on tech support. The higher-ups fed us all lies to tell customers when their service was bad. The GM at the time would smile at you when you talked to him and then humiliate you in front of everyone kind of boss. And the owner was a family friend of my wife, a youth leader for the church and young marrieds group. But at work, he was rude and screamed at us, a total fake act. I was working a pretty entry-level position at the time, but my wife ended up with a health diagnosis that required us to need more money for treatments. So I set up a meeting with the owner, expressed my struggle, and asked for growth opportunities and training to move up in the company. He seemed like he genuinely cared and said we'd talk again soon. Mind you, he spent half of every year in Austria for the youth program, so getting to sit down with him was a rare opportunity. Side note, a few projects he put me on required all his logins to manage his Yelp page and have him sign off to have a graphic designer paid for a troubleshooting guide we designed. I sent maybe 7 emails requesting the same info, and he would never reply. Anyways, a week goes by, and then he calls me into the office. Here I am, all stoked for some good news. He proceeded to point out how the projects he put me on weren't complete. I tried to explain the reason, but he didn't want to hear it. And then he began mocking me using a stupid voice about how my wife had health issues and that I needed more money. And then he laughed at me, tore me a new one, then fired me on the spot. Of course, I could go into the aftermath, but there is a satisfying ending here. A couple years later, it comes out that a family in Virginia is pressing charges against him in regards to something he did with a girl. Mind you, he's a good-looking guy in his early 30s with a wife and 3 young boys. Turns out he was conducting private Bible studies with some of the girls overseas, having them pray together. Yeah, dudes in jail in Virginia for 7+ years. Your sin always finds you out. Story 19. I mean, there are a lot of stories, but to start, most people lie about why they got fired, which HR really can't contest or correct to others because of confidentiality, which sometimes leads to wild situations. Situation A: guy was fired for fooling around with a coworker, was caught by a busted coworker, so on the job site, it was a well known secret. Of course, the dude goes home and makes up some BS to his wife, who comes in making an absolute scene, threatening lawsuits, etc. As HR, we couldn't say anything at all, but we're pretty sure another employee told her because we never saw her again. So awkward. Situation B: I caught a guy drinking. He'd stolen on the job. He admitted it, and we had film. But during his termination, I decided to choose the reason as drinking on the job and not the theft, mostly because I felt bad for the guy, and being terminated for theft can have a negative impact on unemployment payments for years. Basically, I figured this guy messed up, but didn't want to see him punished so severely in the future. Now, since he was fired, he shouldn't receive unemployment money from us, but the idiot filed for it, saying he was unfairly terminated. But of course, I can share details with the judge, so she got the full story and film. He's right there and admits it again. So now, not only is his unemployment denied, the theft incident is on his record. So even if he rightfully files in the future, his payments will be less. I know HR can get a bad rap, and like any other field, there are bad practitioners out there. But many of us try very hard to do the right thing for employees. Story 20. Not an HR employee, but I do have an HR nightmare. I was a contracted employee, which means I had this weird thing where I have two bosses: my contract boss and my tasking boss, who was a permanent employee. We got a new contract boss, and in addition to being openly prejudiced, he was also on a huge power trip. He basically wanted to take all of us contractors out of control of our tasking supervisors and under his direct control so he could farm us out. He didn't want to share supervision of us, he essentially wanted sole custody. There were a lot of things he did, but this one takes the cake. Me and my female coworker were called into a meeting in his office. In addition to telling us about his power trippy plan, which we didn't agree with for a host of reasons, he also decides to complain about our tasking supervisor as well as her boss. Since both of them are women, he calls them the wall of estrogen that's standing in his way of accomplishing his goals. Well, somehow they found he said this. Okay, we told them the moment we got back to the office. So we get called into another meeting. This time we get a lecture on how anything said in a meeting between us is proprietary information to our contract company, not to be released to our tasking supervisors. We decided it was time to call HR. They told my coworker to take a few days off, paid until this could be sorted out. The next day, we have a meeting between my contract boss and two more of my coworkers. This meeting basically consisted of him complaining about how he hasn't been able to accomplish his goals. Then he says, and I wish coworker was here because this next part is about her, and basically spent 10 minutes just ripping into how awful and disloyal she was. The kind of counseling you would generally give behind closed doors instead of in front of everyone, and you would generally give when the person is actually there. The next day after that, he was no longer our supervisor. And if you connected with any of these stories, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video.